Tom had been working as a security guard at a local graveyard for almost a year. He heard all kinds of stories about the paranormal activity that took place there, but he never believed them. On one night shift, Tom was in his usual rounds when he heard a strange noise coming from one of the graves. He thought it was probably just the wind, and he decided to investigate. As he got closer to the grave, he noticed that it was freshly dug up. He could see that it had been tampered with, and he saw finger marks in mud, indicating that it was dug up by hand. Suddenly, out of nowhere, he could hear footsteps behind him. He turned around quickly, but there was nobody there. He shone his flashlight around, but all he could see was darkness. Tom felt like someone was watching him, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He knew that he had to get out of there, but he couldn't move. Out of nowhere, he heard a whisper in his ear. It was a cold and raspy voice that said, "Leave this place now, or you never will." Tom backed away from the grave and ran towards the security office. He was shaken with fear and couldn't believe what had just happened. He knew that he had to report this to the supervisor. The next day, Tom told his supervisor about what had happened the previous night. His supervisor told him that he had heard stories about the paranormal activity at the graveyard, but he never experienced anything like that himself. Tom was still shaken by this experience, but he knew he had to go back to work. He was foolishly determined to find out what was causing the paranormal activity at the graveyard. That night, when Tom went back to the grave again, he was armed with a flashlight and a camera. He wanted to capture any evidence of the paranormal activity that was taking place. As he got to the grave, he could hear strange noises coming from the ground. It sounded like something was moving beneath the surface. Suddenly, the ground beneath Tom's feet began to give way, and he fell into the open grave. He hit the bottom with a thud and lay there dazed. As he looked up, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the grave. It was a ghostly figure, and it was staring down at him. Tom tried to get up, but he couldn't move, as he was frozen with fear. The ghostly figure stared and started to move closer to him. It was then that Tom realised that he should have took the warning from the ghostly voice. He could hear the sound of footsteps all around him. He could also see the ghosts of the people buried in the graveyard arising from their pits. Tom screamed, but nobody could hear him. He was trapped in the graveyard with the ghosts of the dead. The next day, Tom's body was found at the bottom of the grave. The cause of death was unknown, but his camera was nearby. When the film was developed, it showed images of the spirits leaving their resting places. John had been working as a security guard at the local shopping mall for years now, and he was pretty happy with his job, which was to keep an eye on the premises during the night when the mall was closed. He had never encountered anything out of the ordinary during his shifts. He was starting to think this was easy money. However, things took a creepy turn. It was a quiet night, and John was checking the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. The usual stuff. He had just finished his rounds when he was about to settle into his chair and catch up with some reading, when one of the motion detector cameras was set off. So John watched the screen with sharp eyes but saw nothing. But the camera is pointing down the hallway just outside the security office door. Then John could hear footsteps coming from the hallway. John immediately got up, grabbed the flashlight and cautiously made his way to the hallway, shining his flashlight in front of him. As he approached the end of the hallway, he saw a figure standing there. The figure was tall and thin, and long arms and legs. It was wearing a long black coat and a hat that obscured its face. John could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the figure. John spoke, trying to sound calm. "You're not supposed to be here. The mall is closed." The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, staring at John with its face hidden in the shadows. John took a step closer, shining his flashlight directly at the figure's face. As the light hit its face, John gasped in horror. Its face was twisted and distorted, with eyes as black as the darkness. Its mouth was twisted into the sinister grin, revealing the sharp teeth. John felt his legs give out from under him, and he fell to the ground. When he looked up again, the figure had gone. John quickly got to his feet and ran back to the security office. He locked the door behind him and sat down, trying to catch his breath. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. For the rest of the night, John sat in his office too scared to leave. He kept hearing strange noises coming from outside, and he was sure that the figure was still there, lurking somewhere in the mall. And when his shift was finally over, John rushed out the mall as quickly as he could. The next day, John told his boss about the creepy encounter he had. His boss listened but didn't seem to believe him. "It was probably just your imagination," he said dismissively. But John knew what he had seen that night. It was something that was sinister. The hospital had been shut down for years, and there was something eerie about that place. Security guards would never last more than a couple of months before quitting, and they all talk of ghosts, demons that haunt that place. Here's one of those haunting tales from that hospital. As one of the security guards was patrolling the hallway at night, he heard strange noises coming from the empty ward. At first, he thought it was just some old faulty electrics, but the noises continued, and he swore he could hear screams mixed with the sounds of the faulty screeching generator. As he approached the ward, the sound came to an abrupt stop, and he could hear what sounded like some whispering. The whispers were too faint to make out what was being said, but they were definitely human. He pulled out his flashlight and slowly opened the door. The room was pitch black, and the light came from the flashlight was the only light inside the room. The whispers grew louder. As he shone his flashlight around, something terrifying caught his eye. There was a figure standing in a corner of the room. It was a woman with long black hair and tattered clothes. She was rocking back and forth, muttering to herself in a language that he didn't understand. He could feel his heart pound in his chest. He took a step closer and shone his flashlight in her face. When she looked at the light, he wished he was somewhere far from that place. The woman's eyes were filled with blood, and her face was pale and had huge boils all over. He stumbled back and dropped his flashlight. He got up and grabbed his flashlight and ran from the ward as fast as he could, and didn't stop until he was outside. He sat down on the curb trying to catch his breath. He was terrified. He wanted to leave that place, but he had to finish his shift, so for the rest of the night he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept hearing screams from the empty wards, and they could hear the woman still lurking somewhere in the hospital. When his shift was finally over, he quit his job on the spot and never came back. I used to be a security guard working at an old abandoned hospital. The building had been vacant for years, and I had been hired to keep an eye on things until the owners could figure out what to do with the property. The hospital was a massive building with many dark hallways and creepy rooms. I stupidly worked the night shift, so I spent most of the time walking around the building, checking doors, windows, just normal stuff, making sure everything was secure. But one night I heard something coming from the basement. I was told by the owner that the basement was strictly off limits, but I couldn't resist the urge to check it out. As I went down the stairs, I could hear the sound of water dripping from somewhere in the darkness. There was a damp and musty smell that filled the air. It was disgusting, and I had no idea what it was. With my trusty flashlight in hand, I carefully walked through the basement. The walls were painted with strange symbols and drawings like hieroglyphs from Egypt. It was then that I saw a figure in the distance. I thought it was one of the new owners, so I called out to them. However, there was no response, so I realised that it was not a person, but a statue of a strange-looking creature. I shined my light on it and saw that it had a humanoid body, but the head was that of a goat. I was terrified at this point, and I couldn't look at the statue again. Then out of nowhere, something touched my shoulder. I jumped and turned around, but there was no one there. I felt very uneasy and decided to leave the basement immediately. As I made my way up the stairs, I felt like someone was watching me. I could hear footsteps behind me, so I turned, but there was nothing there. I sprinted up the stairs and locked the door to the basement behind me. I was shaking and couldn't believe what had just happened. The rest of the night I walked around the hospital, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. I couldn't wait for my shift to end. When the morning shift arrived, I told my co-worker about my experience in the basement. My co-worker just laughed and said that the hostel was known for being haunted. Let's just say I'll never be going back to that basement again, and I made sure to stay away from the dark corners of the hospital. I do believe that something evil was living in that basement of the older hospital, and I never forget the feeling of being watched and the sound of those footsteps behind me. They will stay with me forever. Thanks for watching Fear Tears, and remember to hit that like and subscribe.